My name is Rebecca Wanasik, and I'm going to tell you the story about how I lost my kids to Missouri's foster care system.
This is my friend Rebecca, who lost her children to the Missouri foster care system. I would encourage you, if you are a foster parent, or maybe you're a biological parent that has lost their children to the foster care system, or maybe a caseworker, please watch this video and listen to Rebecca's story.
In February of 2015, I had just given birth to our fifth baby. Her name was Zayden. She was 9 pounds 4 ounces when she was born. She was pretty big, and she was born at home. When she was about 3 weeks old, I noticed that her ribs would pop and crack when I would hold her, pretty much like when you prop a baby to burp them, and I could just feel her ribs popping. Didn't seem to bother her too much, but I noticed that it was kind of abnormal. I took her to the pediatrician, and he said that she was fine and that all I needed to do was keep doing what I was doing because she was perfect. A few weeks later, she wasn't moving her right arm, so I called the pediatrician's office and I scheduled an appointment with the first available physician. He was not a normal doctor, but she needed to be seen, so I took her in. And he said, "You had home birth?" And he pretty much chastised me for that decision because I was young, I was in my 20s, and he questioned every single thing that we did. Did you have a midwife? Has she been vaccinated? Have you done this whole list of things? And I answered him, and he sent us down saying, well, maybe she has some sort of shoulder dystocia where her shoulder got stuck before she was born. And he was on the right track, I think, in the beginning. He sent us down to x-ray, and he caught me in the hallway on my way back up, and he said, "Hey, I ordered the wrong x-ray. I need you to go back downstairs." And I thought to myself, like, I was in there, I watched them do it, maybe she was too squirmy and they didn't get a clear shot, so we'll go back down. This time they wouldn't let me in the room. I thought maybe they didn't want me to see them having to hold her down or see her upset, so I just sat in the hallway, and I was met by the nurse walking back into the pediatrician's office, and they put me in a back room, which is a different room than the one that we were in where our belongings were. The physician then came in and he said, "Somebody hurt your baby." And all I could do was say, "What?" And I literally think I laughed in his face out of nervousness. And he told me that she had 3 posterior rib fractures and a mildly displaced proximal radial fracture in her right arm. And I had no explanation for her injuries. That day, February 24th of 2015, all 5 of my kids were placed into the Missouri foster care system, where they stayed for the next 10 months. In those 10 months, the Children's Division in Missouri didn't try to look for an alternative diagnosis. They didn't try to look for a differential diagnosis. The physicians didn't try to look for a differential diagnosis. That burden of proof fell on my husband and I. So $59,000 later, we spent hours and hours looking for any physician that could possibly review her medical records and her x-rays, and it was brought to our attention that she had severely low vitamin D levels. Her vitamin D levels were so low that they were almost undetectable. Instead of testing her vitamin D levels when we first went in, they just did the initial x-ray and they sent her off to the hospital in Springfield, Missouri, and they ruled it as abuse. The standard of care for incidents such as that, when an infant presents with only fractures and no other outward signs of abuse, is to run a full differential and test their parathyroid hormone levels, their vitamin D levels, and their alkaline phosphatase levels to rule out infantile rickets, which is ultimately what she had. It took us 10 months to prove that and to get our kids back, and we all really still suffer from the trauma from it today. We actually just passed the anniversary, which was kind of bittersweet. I'm pretty useless the whole month of February, and until I can work through that some more, that's probably just gonna be how it's gonna be. But they are all home now, and we have 8 kids. Our youngest is 9 months old, and we are still moving forward with our lives and trying to make changes for their families.
You have other family members with the same condition, is that right?
So the ehlers-danlos syndrome, which is, it's part of her diagnosis, yes. My husband and I both have it, actually. And I'm convinced that my mother has it. She's never been formally diagnosed, but they have all the signs and symptoms pointing that they also would have the same genetic condition. Until recently, it was only by clinical presentation, but Dr. Michael Hollick found a genetic mutation in a pregnant woman and now has a gene that he can link it to for families just like ours.
So I'm going to say this to try not to cry, but I'm going to try not to cry. You can cry. Can you tell us about the day they were removed? Like, what was going through your mind that day and then in that moment?
So I think this is where a lot of people get really just thrown off by our story, because they're like, why would you sign anything? You should never sign anything. But I was so convinced that nobody had actually hurt this baby that I was willing to cooperate and sign whatever they needed me to sign. And I think I was just in this place of utter shock. I was in shock at the pediatrician's office, and then when they took her by ambulance to Springfield and I wasn't allowed to ride with her, I was like taken aback, I guess, because she had never been away from me ever. She was only 9 weeks old. They intercepted 2 of my kids at the pediatrician's office and then told us that night that we could have no contact with any of them. I don't think there's a way to like accurately portray how bad that was. We did end up going with supervision to the hospital to see her, and I was so, I don't even have words. Hurt, displaced, out of my element, because everything I was saying was being written down and questioned and put under a microscope, that I was physically sick. I had a migraine, and I said, I'm no good here. I'm literally not helping anybody do anything because I could barely stand. My entire life, literally everything I had been doing, I was a full-time stay-at-home parent, and they snatched it in an hour and a half time frame. It was just that fast.
As you were trying to be with your baby, where were the other kids? Where were they taken from?
So 2 of the boys were at the Head Start building in town, and I was trying to get a hold of my friend to go pick them up because my husband's phone wasn't working. He, as you know from being military, they were unloading a Connex from a field duty that they were doing, and he had his cell phone in his pocket but with the screen facing out and busted his screen, so he couldn't get any of my calls. So my friend went and picked the little boys up, and I called his chain of command to try to get a hold of him, and they ended up rallying all the kids to one of our friends' houses, and that's where they stayed for the first 3 days, but she could only take them for those first 72 hours. But that night, they put a no contact order in place. So we had to take clothes and food and things for our kids, and we had to stay in the car and watch their silhouettes through the window of them like jumping around. Sorry. I've actually never told anybody that. So we had to take everything, diapers, wipes, everything we could, and we just sat in the car and cried. Because we could see them, but we couldn't be with them. And I think we knew it was traumatizing, but maybe we had no idea how traumatizing it was going to be. And we had no idea it would last as long as it did. This was the first 8 hours, from the time she was at the pediatrician until we got stuff back to the friend's house where they were. So we were just hoping like, okay, let's get this stuff here, and maybe in 3 days they'll figure out it's a thing and our kids will come home. But we were so wrong. That's not how it happened at all. So
those kids are your world, right?
Yeah, they mean everything to me. I remember growing up like, oh, I just want to be a mom. Like, not that I didn't have any career aspirations or that I didn't want to do wonderful things, but I always wanted to be a mom. My second family away from home did foster care, and they have 13 kids. They've fostered over 350, and that's something I always wanted to do. I just wanted a large family, and I wanted to take care of kids and like help raise these wonderful humans. And then very quickly that was not our reality anymore.
There was a time during all of this they were trying to convince you that your husband had been abusing your children. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my husband was active duty at the time, and he had previously been deployed to Afghanistan, and they said, well, you have 4 older children with no history of abuse or neglect, and this is his first biological child. He probably has PTSD, and they tried to convince me. The only problem was, as you know from being military, he was in the field training when her injuries supposedly occurred, and we lived 35 miles away from where he was, so there was no feasible way for him to get in from the woods to his vehicle to where we were to hurt her in the middle of the night, which is something that the guardian ad litem had said, and then back undetected. So I just knew I knew we would never. He cried when she was born. That's all he's ever wanted. His own kids, his own family. So.
Do you happen to know how your kids felt about that day of removal? Have they been able to talk about that?
So I don't think they're aware of what that day actually was. To be fair, it wasn't like we've seen on other people's videos where parents are screaming and kids are crying and they're just ripping families apart. It wasn't like that. We told our kids for a very long time, like, oh, I'm so sorry you can't come home yet. We're redecorating your bedroom and there's not a safe place for you to sleep, so you're gonna stay with so-and-so for now. And I felt so bad lying to them, but also didn't want to be like, hey, you guys are actually in foster care. And I held with that lie for the first 7 weeks, until the placement that they were with left them at the courthouse and they had to be separated into the care of strangers.
Have they ever talked about being separated and placed in different homes and how that affected them?
Yes. Zachary is our oldest. He did not enjoy it. So Zachary's on the spectrum. He's a very kind, very loving, very sweet kid. He had never been away from me either, and he was 8. Zoe was 6, and Xander was 4. And I'm grateful that Xavier and Zayden don't really have a whole lot of memory from it, but Zachary and Zoe do, and they didn't have any positive things to say. It wasn't all bad, but they were like, yeah, well, we just had to go here and we couldn't do the things that we normally do. Like, the structure of their lives was completely torn apart. So I'm pretty sure the boys, when they did separate them, they put the boys in one home and the girls in the other. And we are still actually good friends with the placement that had the girls. It was their first placement. Their heart was in it for all the right reasons before they were jaded from anything they had seen. And it happens, you know. The boys, those foster parents didn't believe a single thing that came out of our mouths. The social workers told them what they told them, and we were abusers, and that's all they saw.
They kind of immediately just assumed that you were guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then as far as the foster mom or the foster parents that were a little more encouraging, they rooted you on to try to reunify. Is that right?
Yeah, they kept saying, this just doesn't seem right. It doesn't seem right. You're doing all of the things that they're telling you to do. You're jumping through all of the hoops. People who abuse their kids, people who have drug problems, people who legitimately probably shouldn't have their children, don't go to these lengths, let alone as quickly as we were.
What would you say to a mom? I'm gonna start crying. Okay, hold on.
Sorry, join us. I put
okay.
my good makeup on.
What would you say to a biological parent or a caregiver who has lost their children? How would you encourage them to keep pushing through?
Remember what your end goal is. And that end goal isn't a destination, it's a process. And you can't stop fighting, because that's literally what they want you to do. They want you to stop. And it's not worth it. The risk can't outweigh the benefit type of situation. You literally have to risk everything, because those are your kids. Those are your kids. And I remember, this is another terrible. I remember sitting at a stoplight after one of our family support team meetings, and I was just like shaken. They had changed our permanency plan to adoption very early on. Our attorneys were like, I don't know why they're doing this. And I actually believe we were on our way to our family support team meeting. And I looked at my husband and I just started crying, and I said to him, if everything fails, if nothing else can come from this, Zachary and Zoe are old enough to find me when they're older. Like, what? As a parent who has only ever wanted to parent her kids, I should never even have been placed in a position to feel like that's something I should have to say out loud. Those were my kids. They were my flesh and blood. Even if they weren't my flesh and blood, those are my kids. I put everything that I am, I poured it into being the best parent that I could be for them. And for me to even think that, like, all right, they're gonna adopt out my kids, they're gonna send them wherever, and I'm not gonna see them ever again until they're older and they come find me. No parent should have to think that, ever. I do wanna say that as a bio mom who had her children removed, there is a huge stigma in our society about the foster care system. Is it perfect? No. Is it needed? Absolutely. But if you're a foster parent and you find yourself in a situation where you have an infant with unexplained fractures and the parents keep saying, I don't know how they occurred, or maybe when I was changing his diaper, or maybe when I was doing whatever, that's not an admission of guilt. There could absolutely be an underlying medical condition that's going undiagnosed because the physicians aren't doing their due diligence. So if you feel like you want to judge the family and make your own opinions, remember why you started doing it. It's not about the parents, it's about the kids and being there for the kids and providing a safe space for the kids until it can be sorted out. Just doing that would save so much trauma and heartache for everybody.
Rebecca's story is both beautiful and completely heart-wrenching, and as a mom of 10 kids, I can't even imagine being in her shoes. If you or someone you know maybe have a similar story and need some resources, please don't hesitate to reach out to Fractured Families, and I will see you next time.